Beneath the crowns, behind the portraits, and beyond the fairy tales lies a royal history that smells less like roses and more like rot. Forget the romance. The British monarchy has been caught red-handed in everything from secret lovers and festering wounds to unwashed dogs and dinner plates revisited twice. These aren't rumors. They're real, verified, vile, and sometimes hilariously human. So grab your tea, but maybe skip the snacks, because we're diving mouth first into 25 disgusting royal rumors that actually turned out to be true. Some secrets age like fine wine. Others, like spoiled meat in a gold-plated fridge. Before we dive in, quick pause. If you love dark royal secrets, unsettling truths, and bedtime stories that make you side-eye history books, hit subscribe so you never miss a drop of royal dysfunction. While you're here, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Singapore? I want to know who's brave enough to be here at this hour, unraveling the monarchy with me. 1. Queen Elizabeth I's blackened teeth. In the elaborate mythos of Queen Elizabeth I, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, England's phoenix risen from the ashes of her father's tyranny, there is no shortage of symbols. The white-painted face, the pearl-drenched gowns, the solemn portraits staring down from the walls of castles and classrooms alike. But behind the iconography, behind the myth-making, was a detail that many diplomats found impossible to ignore: her teeth. Specifically, that they were black, rotted, visibly decayed. And the more she smiled, the more Europe whispered. The rumor began quietly, as most royal rumors do. Foreign ambassadors returning from Elizabeth's court would include subtle notes in their reports back home, polite, vague, but unmistakably critical. One such diplomat remarked that the Queen was majestic in bearing, but marked by the decay of age. Another wrote that she had blackened stumps where teeth should be. It sounded exaggerated, an insult disguised as a footnote. But it wasn't. It was true. By the time Elizabeth reached middle age, her teeth were in a state of visible decline. When she opened her mouth to speak, her courtiers sometimes averted their eyes. When she laughed, rarely and carefully, it was impossible not to notice the dark lines along her gums. Decay, in the mouth of a monarch, became an open secret. And what made it all the more tragic was how much of it was self-inflicted. Elizabeth had a sweet tooth, an impressive one. She was known to consume sugared delicacies in vast quantities: candied violets, preserved fruits, sweetmeats soaked in honey and wine. Sugar, in Tudor England, was not just a luxury, it was a status symbol. Imported at great cost from distant colonies, it was rare, refined, and refined again until it dissolved on the tongue. To serve sugar at court was to announce your wealth. To consume it in excess was to announce your power. Elizabeth didn't just eat sugar, she reveled in it. And in doing so, she indulged in one of the most corrosive habits of her time. Tudor dental hygiene was primitive at best. Tooth powders made from crushed bone and brick were common, but largely ineffective. Toothbrushes were still rare curiosities. And sugar, glorious, addictive sugar, was fast becoming the enemy of enamel. As her teeth worsened, Elizabeth tried to disguise the damage. She limited her public appearances. She covered her mouth when she spoke. And eventually, she turned to a kind of proto-cosmetic workaround: tooth black, a powder used to stain the remaining teeth darker so that the decay appeared intentional, a grim fashion statement rather than a medical emergency. And yet, for all this, she refused to have her teeth pulled. One of the most infamous stories of her reign involves a court physician begging her to have a particularly rotted tooth extracted. She resisted, out of fear, out of vanity, out of sheer royal stubbornness. In an effort to reassure her, one of her courtiers, John Aylmer, agreed to have a tooth pulled in front of her, right there in the chamber. He sat in the chair. The barber surgeon did his work, blood and all. And only after watching someone else suffer did Elizabeth finally relent. But by then, the damage was done. Her teeth were already more symbolic than functional. She reportedly struggled to eat certain foods. Her speech occasionally slurred. She avoided long public orations, not simply from age or fatigue, but to hide the sound of a crumbling mouth. What makes this detail so significant, so worthy of chronicling alongside wars, reforms, and rebellions, is what it reveals about monarchy itself. Elizabeth was a queen who ruled through image. Her face was her brand. Her body was the nation. Her virginity became a tool of statecraft. But her teeth? Her teeth told the truth. They told of indulgence, vanity, human fragility. They were a visible reminder that even the most powerful woman in the world was still, in the end, mortal, subject to the same biological betrayals as the peasants she ruled. And yet, somehow, she managed to turn even this into part of the performance. Black teeth became fashionable at court. Whether to flatter the queen or mask one's own dental misfortunes, many women began staining their teeth as well. Rot, reframed as royalty. A grotesque kind of flattery. It was the perfect ending to a reign built on contradiction. The virgin queen who wasn't chaste, the strong ruler who hid her face, the fearsome monarch who could not bring herself to face the dentist. But in the end, that's what monarchy has always been. A mask made of gold and silk, hiding something quietly rotting underneath. And if you ever forget that, just remember, sometimes the most unsettling truths about royalty aren't the wars they start or the lovers they lose. Sometimes it's what you see when they smile. 2. Henry VIII's obesity and stench. For much of his early reign, Henry VIII was a Renaissance poster child. Athletic, handsome, multilingual, musically gifted, and disturbingly charming. He jousted. He danced. He wrote love poetry and theology. He was the Tudor dream, until he wasn't. By the time he reached his 40s, Henry VIII had become something else entirely. Bloated, immobile, ulcer-ridden, and, according to many first-hand accounts, so foul-smelling that courtiers had to steel themselves just to stand near him. The transformation wasn't just tragic, it was grotesque. And the most humiliating part? People could smell it. Let's begin with the weight. As a young man, Henry was lean and over 6 feet tall, an imposing figure in a time when most people stood a foot shorter. His waist reportedly measured around 32 inches at age 21. By the end of his life, it had ballooned to over 54 inches. He weighed well over 300 pounds, possibly more. Royal tailors were forced to create custom clothing with reinforced seams, and his armor had to be redesigned multiple times to accommodate his ever-expanding girth. But it wasn't just the size, it was the reason for the size. After a jousting accident in 1536, Henry suffered a serious leg injury that left him with an open wound that never properly healed. The wound became a chronic ulcer, festering and painful, often requiring draining and constant dressing. The king, once active and outdoorsy, became increasingly sedentary, depressed, and prone to overindulgence in food and drink. And now for the part his subjects rarely wrote in poetry, the smell. Multiple accounts from those who served him confirmed that the king's leg wounds emitted an unbearable stench. Chronic infection in a pre-antibiotic world wasn't just painful, it was putrid. The ulcer oozed. It leaked. It needed to be cleaned daily, often more. His physicians tried everything. Ointments, bandages, cauterization, but nothing worked. The king's stink became court knowledge, and everyone knew to keep a polite distance. But of course no one said it directly. Not to his face. Henry ruled with terrifying authority. He had people executed for far less than impolite comments. Still, foreign ambassadors whispered it in letters. Courtiers hinted at it in diaries. Even his wives couldn't quite avoid the implication. One ambassador noted that the king had become so large in body and so afflicted by his sore leg that he can scarcely move without assistance. Others noted that the king would sometimes stay in his private chambers for days, refusing to be seen, his mood dark and his body in constant discomfort. Imagine the contradiction. The man who had once danced in brocade doublets, who had strutted through palaces in silk stockings, was now swollen, sweating, and seated, with servants regularly forced to dress a leg wound that gave off the unmistakable smell of rot. And because this was the royal court, where appearances mattered more than honesty, his portraits lied. Painters like Hans Holbein depicted Henry as fearsome, upright, and godlike, his belly tucked in, his legs straight, his face serene. But those who saw him in the flesh knew otherwise. By the final years of his life, Henry could barely walk. He used mechanical hoists to move between rooms. He lashed out in pain, isolated himself, and drowned his frustrations in ever more decadent banquets. His health had deteriorated into a state of managed misery. But none of this was just personal. It was political. Henry's physical decline mirrored the spiritual and political chaos he unleashed on England. A nation once unified under Rome was now fractured, reeling from the Reformation. Monasteries were dissolved, executions mounted, wives discarded. His body, bloated, ulcerated, foul, became a living metaphor for a monarchy consuming itself from within. Still, the court carried on. The candles burned, the trumpets played, the letters HR were etched into everything, and the groom of the stool continued his solemn duty, trying not to gag. Because even kings, especially kings, can't outrun the consequences of their appetites. But as offensive as Henry's presence became, his decline remained a private affair, carefully managed within the walls of his palaces. Centuries later, another royal scandal would erupt not in whispers or courtly complaints, but over the airwaves. A private phone call, an intimate remark, and a sentence involving feminine hygiene that would become one of the most unforgettable, absurdly human royal gaffes in history. Next up, Prince Charles and the tampon tape that the royal family desperately wished had stayed a rumor. If you've made it this far through infected ulcers and royal stench, you're exactly the kind of person we want hanging around. So go ahead. Subscribe to the channel for more unsettling truths they never taught in school. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Late night doom scroll in Dublin? Lunch break in Lagos? I'm genuinely curious who's keeping the royal receipts with me. 3. Prince Charles wanting to be Camilla's tampon. There are many ways to accidentally unravel centuries of royal mystique. You could wear the wrong hat, trip on the tarmac, mispronounce a foreign dignitary's name, or, in the case of Prince Charles, heir to the British throne, you could be caught on tape telling your mistress you wish you were reincarnated as her tampon. Yes, that actually happened. It was 1993. Britain was in the throes of post-Thatcher fatigue, tabloids were frothing with scandal, and the House of Windsor was rapidly becoming less of a divine institution and more of a public melodrama with velvet curtains. Enter Tampongate, an event so bizarre, so embarrassing, and so undeniably true that it remains one of the most humiliating royal gaffes ever recorded. The recording in question was of a phone conversation between Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles from 1989, when he was still married to Princess Diana, and Camilla was also married to someone else. Somehow the call had been intercepted, allegedly by an amateur radio enthusiast, and held in quiet circulation until the early 90s, when it was published in full, unfiltered glory by an Australian magazine, and then splashed across the British tabloids shortly after. And the contents? Shakespearean, if Shakespeare wrote late-night romance with a touch of uncomfortable anatomy. The call starts innocently enough. A bit of flirting. The predictable awkwardness of two middle-aged people navigating their emotions like teenagers with titles. Then, it spirals. Charles, evidently trying to express just how close he wanted to be to Camilla, says the now infamous line, "I want to be reincarnated as your tampon." There's a pause, then laughter, then more banter. And with that, the phrase was forever etched into the public's memory, an echo of royal intimacy so painfully absurd that it instantly erased any remaining illusions that the monarchy lived above the petty embarrassments of ordinary life. The fallout was nuclear. Palace aides scrambled. Clarence House offered no official comment. Newspapers couldn't print it fast enough. Morning radio shows replayed dramatic reenactments, often with voice actors and canned music. The phrase was printed on novelty T-shirts. Stand-up comedians thanked the heavens. And a centuries-old royal brand, carefully burnished with jewels, pomp, and silence, was reduced to a joke about feminine hygiene. Behind the scenes, it was a disaster. Charles's already deteriorating marriage to Diana had no hope of survival after the tapes became public. While the world snickered at the tampon line, Diana quietly watched her suspicions become confirmed in the most humiliating way imaginable. This wasn't gossip anymore. It was documented desire. And not just desire, but infatuation, in the most unguarded and adolescent form. For Charles, the public's reaction was brutal. He was mocked, ridiculed, and painted as out of touch. The future king was now Prince Tampax to late-night hosts and headline writers. His image as a dignified royal was shredded by a single sentence. And Camilla, who had previously been a peripheral figure in royal gossip, suddenly became a household name, though not initially in a flattering light. But over time, the scandal shifted. What had started as pure ridicule began to expose a deeper truth, that the royal family was not simply dysfunctional, but deeply human. Flawed, awkward, messy, even a little cringeworthy. It stripped away centuries of myth. The divine right of kings couldn't protect you from a hot mic. What made the incident especially potent was its intimacy. This wasn't a press leak or a policy failure. It was a moment of vulnerability, of unfiltered affection, albeit expressed with profoundly unfortunate imagery. In its own strange way, it was real love, clumsy, obsessive, oddly sweet, and totally inappropriate. And in that way, it was perhaps the most honest moment in royal history. Because for all the robes and rituals, the monarchy survives not just on tradition, but on connection, on the illusion that these people, for all their diamonds and dainties, still live lives that vaguely resemble our own. And nothing made them feel more relatable and more humanly ridiculous than the future King of England longing to become a product in the feminine care aisle. Over the years, Charles and Camilla would weather the scandal, eventually marrying and repositioning themselves within a more forgiving narrative. But the tape remains. A fossilized moment of awkward passion, preserved in media forever. And as strange as it all sounds, it wasn't the first time a British royal found himself entangled with a scandal that involved furniture, weight, and romantic logistics. Long before Charles whispered his way into infamy, one of his predecessors, Edward VII, made headlines in Parisian brothels for a peculiar contraption built to accommodate his royal desires. Next up, the curious case of Edward VII's custom-built sex chair. Yes, that rumor was true too. 4. Edward VII's sex chair. If the walls of certain Parisian establishments could talk, they'd beg not to. But even silence has limits, and so, through whispers and museum exhibits, we know that King Edward VII, son of Queen Victoria and future emperor of half the planet, had a distinctive taste in furniture. Not for aesthetic reasons, not even for comfort, but for logistics. You see, Edward wasn't just a regular at brothels. He was a connoisseur, a frequent flyer, and eventually an innovator. the man had a problem, one that required engineering. In his later years, Edward grew large, not pleasantly plump or slightly soft. Large, decadently, purposefully large. He was, in many ways, a living symbol of British imperialism. Overweight, overindulgent, and unfazed by moderation. His appetites were legendary. He once reportedly spent 3 hours at dinner, consuming 8 courses, followed by liqueurs, cigars, and, if the schedule allowed, a trip to Le Chabanais, Paris's most elite brothel. But physical girth has its limits, especially when paired with energetic recreational pursuits. Edward, to put it bluntly, found conventional arrangements lacking. And so, in the grand tradition of British innovation, a solution was engineered. The love chair was custom-built to Edward's dimensions and preferences. Known as la chaise d'amour, it resembled something between a chaise lounge and a theatrical prop from a particularly avant-garde play. It allowed for multiple participants, reportedly 2 women at once, while supporting Edward's generous frame and minimal physical exertion. The chair still exists. You can go see it in a Paris museum, carefully preserved like a war relic no one dares explain to the school tour groups. It's not just the chair itself that's unsettling. It's what it reveals. The monarchy's carefully concealed reality. While Queen Victoria was busy moralizing, mourning, and presiding over an age named after her, her son was building a reputation as one of Europe's most dedicated hedonists. He was a regular in Paris's red light district. He had affairs with actresses, countesses, and courtesans. One of his most well-known mistresses, Lily Langtry, later became a celebrity in her own right. Another, Alice Keppel, would become the great-grandmother of Camilla Parker Bowles, because irony never sleeps. Of course, none of this was supposed to be public knowledge. The royal household maintained strict silence. Official biographies sanitized Edward's life into that of a charming playboy who loved a good cigar and the odd flirtation. But beneath the surface, the reality was far more indulgent and far more literal. Eyewitness accounts from brothel workers, diaries from diplomats, and the continued existence of that infamous chair all confirm what many suspected. Edward VII treated pleasure like policy. Yet, what makes this story truly fascinating isn't just its salaciousness, it's its absurd normalcy within royal tradition. Because in the context of monarchy, excess is not an anomaly. It's practically a birthright. Edward didn't invent this behavior. He inherited it, refined it, upholstered it, and left it behind like a carved monument to aristocratic entitlement. When he finally became king, after waiting almost his entire adult life in the shadow of Queen Victoria's extended widowhood, Edward rebranded himself. He presented a polished exterior, refined, diplomatic, even kingly. But behind the throne was the same man who once commissioned a structural solution to his physical limitations in the pursuit of pleasure. And the public never forgot. The rumors never died. Because the truth, confirmed and upholstered, was simply too strange to ignore. And maybe that's the most royal thing of all. The ability to commit excess so outrageous, it becomes a footnote in your biography rather than a scandal. For Edward, it wasn't shameful, it was simply Tuesday. But he wasn't the only royal to conceal a growing waistline behind layers of ceremony and carefully crafted garments. Another king, a generation later, took the art of royal denial even further, hiding his enormous appetite behind a corset and collapsing under the weight of his own indulgence. Let's revisit George IV and the secret he could barely button shut. 5. King George IV's secret obesity. George IV was the kind of monarch who could make excess look like etiquette. He didn't simply indulge, he curated his overindulgence. Everything he did with theatrical flair. His clothes, his banquets, his architecture, his personality. He wasn't just living, he was performing. And at the heart of that performance was a body groaning under the weight of silk, starch, sugar, and denial. To the public, George tried to present himself as a refined and dignified ruler. Portraits depicted him in flowing regalia, standing with one foot slightly forward like a man preparing to stride confidently into history. He wore military uniforms bedazzled with medals he had not earned in wars he had not fought. His tailors, already accustomed to royal vanity, were under constant orders to reshape his image, sometimes literally, by cinching, padding, and redirecting the eye. But behind the curtains, quite literally, the king was falling apart. He was rumored to wear a corset so tight it threatened to collapse his lungs. Some claimed he couldn't bend over to pick up a dropped handkerchief. Others whispered that his valet had to help him dress with tools more commonly found in sail rigging. His daily ritual reportedly involved being squeezed into his clothing like a festive pudding, an operation that left him breathless and occasionally faint. When George died in 1830, the rumors were officially confirmed. His waist measured nearly 50 inches. And while today's standards might label that size as concerning, in the 19th century, it was considered almost royal blasphemy. Kings were meant to be larger than life, not physically incapacitated by their appetites. But let's rewind. Because George's physical transformation didn't happen overnight. As Prince Regent, he had already cultivated a reputation as a gourmand. He lived for banquets. He favored dishes drenched in cream, seasoned with brandy, and followed by mountains of pastries. He drank heavily, snacked constantly, and spared no expense in making sure his meals were as elaborate as his politics were muddled. He commissioned the Brighton Pavilion, a seaside pleasure palace with onion domes, dragon motifs, and enough rococo embellishment to induce dizziness. The pavilion wasn't just a vacation home. It was a fantasy fortress, a place to escape judgment, and more importantly, mirrors. The interiors were designed for distraction. If the king was bloated and sweating through his waistcoat, no one could see it beneath the glittering chandeliers and velvet curtains. Reality melted in those rooms along with the sorbets. But the thing about appetites of any kind is that they demand escalation, and George's hunger wasn't just for food. It was for adoration, for beauty, for control. He obsessively commissioned portraits, demanding artists make him appear slimmer, younger, and, when all else failed, taller. One painter, Sir Thomas Lawrence, was allegedly asked to erase at least 20 pounds in paint. It worked. The public saw a monarch radiating elegance and discipline. Meanwhile, behind palace walls, George was struggling to stand for extended periods. And yet, few dared challenge him. Those who did, like cartoonists and radical pamphleteers, were treated as traitors. They mocked his expanding waistline, his extravagant habits, his pitiful attempts to mask reality. But their ridicule didn't dent his ego. If anything, it made him dig deeper into his illusions. Because monarchy, for George IV, wasn't about truth, it was about spectacle. And in that sense, he was wildly successful. He kept the reality of his condition hidden beneath layers of satin and sycophancy. Even in death, his body told the story. Courtiers were stunned at his size. Doctors quietly confirmed what had long been whispered. The man who once demanded to be remembered as a great patron of the arts was, in the end, remembered for something else. Eating himself into history. But as grotesque as his indulgences were, George's legacy was still manageable by the standards of royal scandal. After all, being secretly overweight is still somewhat human. What happens, though, when the whispers involve not food, but the kind of company a royal keeps? And when that company includes one of the most notorious names of the 21st century? Let's talk about Prince Andrew, and the friendship that Buckingham Palace wishes had stayed a rumor. 6. Prince Andrew and Jeffrey Epstein. There are scandals, and then there are sinkholes, events so humiliating and corrosive they pull down everything around them. For the British royal family, few names evoke such immediate discomfort as Prince Andrew. Once branded Randy Andy by a gleeful tabloid press for his bachelor escapades, Andrew went from party prince to permanent liability, tethered to one of the most toxic figures in modern memory, Jeffrey Epstein. The whispers started years before the public paid attention. There were photographs, quietly circulated, occasionally dismissed. There were stories from insiders, murmurs about private jets and luxury homes, about close friendships with men who had far too many secrets and far too few boundaries. But in the smoke-choked world of high society, where powerful people orbit one another like planets in their own separate solar system, such rumors are background noise. Until they aren't. By the time Epstein was arrested in 2008 for soliciting a minor, Prince Andrew's name was already surfacing uncomfortably close to the edges of the narrative. But it wasn't until 2011, when the now infamous photograph of Andrew with his arm around a young Virginia Giuffre, Epstein's most outspoken accuser, hit the mainstream press, that things began to unravel. It wasn't just the picture, it was the setting, a private townhouse, a young girl, Ghislaine Maxwell standing in the background. The whole thing had the aesthetic of a crime scene frozen in time. Still, Buckingham Palace hoped it would fade. The royal playbook had weathered worse, or so they thought. But this time the rules didn't apply. Epstein's second arrest in 2019 reopened every door that had been politely closed. His death only intensified public scrutiny. And sitting directly in the eye of the storm was the Duke of York. There were flight logs, phone records, dinner guest lists. Andrew's name popped up again and again. And yet, when finally confronted, he responded not with clarity, but with what can only be described as one of the most ill-advised interviews in royal history. Broadcast by the BBC in November 2019, Andrew's appearance on Newsnight was intended as damage control. Instead, it detonated. Over the course of the interview, the prince dismissed accusations with a mix of disbelief and baffling deflection. When asked about his relationship with Epstein, he insisted it was beneficial because it introduced him to useful people. When asked about Virginia Giuffre's allegations, he denied ever meeting her, despite the photographic evidence, claiming he had no recollection. And then came the moment that would stick. Giuffre had described Andrew sweating profusely during their alleged encounter, to which Andrew replied, completely straight-faced, that he could not have been sweating at the time because he had a medical condition resulting from his service in the Falklands War that rendered him temporarily incapable of perspiring. Yes, that was the defense. I physically couldn't sweat. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it hadn't been so tragic. Here was a man born into immense privilege, cloaked in titles, insulated by layers of handlers, offering one of the most surreal public defenses in modern memory, all while standing accused of consorting with a convicted sex offender. Public response was immediate and brutal. Charities distanced themselves, institutions cut ties. His military appointments were quietly shelved. And eventually the palace made it official. Prince Andrew was stepping back from royal duties for the foreseeable future. But the damage was already done. The monarchy, for all its mystique and ceremony, had been dragged into the swamp. The whispers had been true. The photograph was real. The connections undeniable. What makes Andrew's scandal so uniquely disturbing isn't just the alleged behavior. It's the entitlement. The cluelessness. The assumption that he could emerge unscathed simply because of who he was. The House of Windsor had spent centuries polishing its image into something untouchable. And yet in one interview, all it took was a man defending himself with a story about not sweating to remind the world that titles are no shield from stupidity. Still, the crown has always had a strange relationship with bad behavior. Some royals burn reputations in public. Others erode them slowly, behind closed doors, with cigarette ashes, interrupted conversations, and one perfectly timed eye roll. Enter Princess Margaret, the royal rebel who never cared if you liked her, and often proved it at dinner. 7. Princess Margaret's rude behavior. In every family, there's one member who thrives on tension. The one who speaks too loudly at dinner, says what everyone's thinking but shouldn't say, and makes sure the room never forgets they're in it. In the British royal family, that person was Princess Margaret. Younger sister to Queen Elizabeth II, Margaret was born into a life of rigid protocol and endless obligations, most of which she despised. She wasn't the monarch, and she didn't want to be. What she did want, however, was attention, and she got it. Not for her diplomacy, not for her charity work, but for her rudeness, an art form she elevated into a personal brand. To the public, she was glamorous, stylish, a symbol of post-war modernity with her Dior gowns, cigarettes, and cocktail-in-hand photo ops. She mingled with celebrities, lounged on private Caribbean islands, and carried herself like royalty in exile from her own family. But behind closed doors, Margaret had a reputation so infamous it inspired both awe and fear. Whispers began to surface in the 1950s. Staff at Kensington Palace described her as imperious, volatile, and, most memorably, delighted by cruelty. Footmen and maids reported being dismissed mid-sentence. Guests claimed she would correct their grammar before they'd even sat down. One visitor recalled complimenting her appearance, only to be met with, "Yes, I am fabulous, aren't I?" Another was berated for daring to speak before being spoken to, as if the 20th century hadn't already happened outside the palace gates. And then there was the cigarette story. Recounted by multiple witnesses, it became a kind of royal urban legend. The tale goes like this. Someone at a dinner party irritated Margaret. How, no one remembers. But rather than address it with words, she calmly reached out, extinguished her cigarette in their mashed potatoes, and continued eating. No comment, no apology, just a silent royal mic drop. This wasn't rebellious flair, it was a pattern. Margaret reportedly ordered drinks like a general commanding troops and demanded silence during her entrance at social gatherings. She once told the wife of a British ambassador that her jewelry looked like it came from Woolworths. She famously visited the United States, met President Johnson, and left everyone wondering whether her arrogance was an official diplomatic stance or just personal flair. One journalist quipped that if Queen Elizabeth represented duty, Margaret represented divine punishment. But perhaps the most unsettling part of her behavior wasn't how she treated the public. It was how she treated those closest to her. Friends described a woman who could be warm one minute and scathing the next. Her staff lived in a constant state of vigilance, never knowing whether the princess would greet them with charm or contempt. Biographers documented accounts of emotional whiplash, Margaret hosting intimate dinners one night and cutting people from her life the next day, often for slights so small only she could detect them. Yet somehow, the monarchy protected her. That was the most curious part. No matter how offensive or unkind her behavior became, there was always a buffer of courtiers, spin doctors, and institutional silence to smooth it over. When tabloids dared to criticize her, palace insiders blamed stress, grief, pressure. The usual explanations. Anything but the obvious truth. Margaret was simply, consistently rude. Of course, some argued she was merely misunderstood. A woman trapped in a golden cage, denied love, her relationship with Peter Townsend famously squashed by royal protocol, resentful of her sister's power and desperate for a role of her own. And perhaps there's truth to that, but it doesn't explain the cigarette in the mashed potatoes. What Margaret revealed, in all her brutal honesty, was something the monarchy rarely shows. Pettiness. Not the grand sins of war or scandal, but the small, needling wounds of ego and privilege. She didn't break rules to change the system. She broke them because she could. And while some royal indiscretions are concealed in coded language or carefully phrased denial, others come with a prescription label. Which brings us to Queen Victoria. Sainted widow, imperial matriarch, and casual user of something a little stronger than tea. 8. Queen Victoria's opium use. Queen Victoria was a figure carved into the bedrock of British identity, a symbol of morality, restraint, and domestic virtue. A woman who wore black for 40 years to mourn her husband, whose name defined an era of prudery so extreme that even table legs were reportedly covered for modesty, though that one, fittingly, is more rumor than reality. But what is real, what quietly undermines the buttoned-up mythology of Victoria the Empress, is a small bottle, or several, tucked discreetly among the drawers of the royal physician's kit. The label? Laudanum, an old-world euphemism for a remarkably simple compound, opium, dissolved in alcohol. Yes, the woman who presided over a global empire, who enforced rigid codes of public morality, and who allegedly once asked if people really needed to talk about childbirth, was, for most of her adult life, dosed regularly with liquid opium. Of course, no one called it that. Not then. In the 19th century, laudanum was as common as aspirin is today. It was prescribed for headaches, sleeplessness, nerves, menstrual cramps, childbirth, and anything that might fall under the umbrella of female troubles. And Victoria, who endured 9 pregnancies and the political stresses of ruling an empire where the sun never set but the critics never slept, qualified on all counts. Her doctors, particularly the trusted Sir James Clark and later Sir James Reed, were known to administer laudanum for a variety of ailments. It wasn't whispered, it wasn't shameful, and it wasn't unusual. This was medical standard practice. But here's where it turns. While the use itself was medically acceptable for the time, the implication that the Queen herself relied on a form of opiate to get through her days casts a very different light on the image of iron self-control so carefully cultivated in her public persona. The official story of Queen Victoria is one of emotional distance and steely decorum. Her letters often carry a tone of detached command. Her speeches are formal to the point of frostbite. Yet behind the scenes, personal diaries and correspondence reveal a woman who suffered intensely, physically and emotionally. Crippling menstrual pain, migraines, grief, depression. After Albert's death, she became virtually nocturnal, rarely appearing in daylight, and required constant medical attention. During this time, laudanum was prescribed more frequently, a quiet salve for the wounds she refused to show the public. Historians confirm that her use was consistent and medically supervised, but still consistent. And while it never escalated into what we'd call addiction by modern standards, it certainly qualifies as dependence. The Empress of India, ruling over millions with Victorian moral precision, was quietly sipping a substance now classified as a controlled drug. The irony is almost literary. An empire pushing opium into China by force while its own monarch was being administered the same extract for cramps. A queen whose name was synonymous with abstinence and moral rigor routinely prescribed a substance that would eventually come to symbolize the very opposite. And yet, no scandal ever emerged during her lifetime. No public outcry, no tabloid fury, because it wasn't framed as vice, it was medicine. And the Victorians, ever masters of euphemism, were happy to draw that line in ink and never revisit it. Even so, the fact remains. The moral backbone of an empire was chemically softened. The Queen held together by corsets, etiquette, and opium. But Victoria was hardly the only monarch to indulge in self-medicating illusions. Some monarchs soothed their suffering with tinctures. Others wandered into the trees and began speaking to them. Let's talk about George III and the oaks he believed were fellow kings. 9. Henry VIII's gluttonous banquets. If monarchy is theater, then Henry VIII was its most committed method actor, rehearsing the role of divinely chosen king through a never-ending sequence of wars, wives, and, well, dinner. Long before his ulcerated leg began to leak or his temper turned executions into a family hobby, Henry ruled through spectacle. And nowhere was that spectacle more grotesquely staged than at his dining table. To put it plainly, the man could eat. And he did. Publicly, elaborately, excessively. Visitors from foreign courts came to see the King of England, but left talking about the food. Accounts from French and Venetian ambassadors describe feasts that bordered on ritual excess. Swans roasted whole. Peacocks refeathered for presentation. Pastries shaped like mythical beasts. Dishes gilded in gold leaf, served not for flavor, but for display. It wasn't just dinner. It was propaganda. Calories as currency, indulgence as influence. Henry's appetite wasn't simply personal, it was political. In a time when most of his subjects lived on a diet of stale bread, pottage, and watery ale, Henry consumed in public like a man announcing his divine right to do so. His banquets became expressions of royal might, opulent proof that he could command not just armies and laws, but spices, meats, and exotic imports from across the globe. And he wasn't just showing off. He was actively consuming the fruits of empire, taxation, and the dissolution of monasteries. All of that wealth, liquidated land, seized treasure, made its way to the royal court, and then, quite literally, into the king's mouth. By the later years of his reign, Henry reportedly ate as many as 13 dishes in a single sitting. His meals began with heavily salted meats and pies, followed by boiled or roasted game, then sweets drenched in sugar and cream. Ale and red wine accompanied each course, and if he didn't like the food, it was sent back, not quietly, but with public disdain. It's worth noting that many of these meals were consumed in front of an audience. The Great Hall at Hampton Court, for example, was not a private space. Nobles, officials, foreign envoys, even carefully vetted commoners could witness the royal supper. It was choreographed, each gesture, each bite, each belch, a deliberate display of excess, a show of bodily dominance. But behind the performance was a body beginning to break. Despite his enormous intake, Henry's nutrition was predictably catastrophic. He developed gout, his teeth decayed, his weight ballooned, and the wound on his leg, first from a jousting accident, later made worse by his sedentary lifestyle, never healed. Still, he continued eating, and the court continued watching. And they did more than just watch. They enabled. Royal kitchens employed over 200 people. Daily meal preparation involved boiling, baking, roasting, and carving, often with food sourced from the king's own estates. The royal accounts show the staggering scale: over 1,200 oxen, 8,000 sheep, and 1.3 million gallons of ale consumed annually by the Tudor court. This wasn't just indulgence, it was systematized. It was the machinery of monarchy translated into digestion. And yet, Henry seemed to believe it was all justified. He saw his body not as a personal vessel, but as a symbol of state. To feed himself was to feed England. To feast was to remind everyone, courtiers, ambassadors, and enemies, that he was God's anointed glutton. The irony is hard to miss. The man who declared himself head of the Church of England, who demanded spiritual obedience, spent his evenings devouring whole animals like a pagan deity. He rewrote the Bible to suit his desires, and then washed it down with a goblet of Burgundy and a slab of sugared pork. And while this banquet of ego might seem like peak Tudor absurdity, it was far from the most politically dangerous appetite in royal history. Because another king, less gluttonous but far more ideologically indulgent, once looked across the channel and found something horrifyingly seductive in the rising tide of fascism. Next, we peel back the layers on Edward VIII and the Nazi rumors that proved far more than speculative. 10. Edward VIII's Nazi sympathies. For a man who once wore the crown, Edward VIII left remarkably little behind. No wars, no reforms, no heirs, no lasting policies. But he did leave a lingering stain, a scandal so morally corrosive that Buckingham Palace has spent nearly a century trying to file it under misunderstood. The rumor was simple and horrifying, that the former King of England harbored sympathies for Adolf Hitler. For decades, this was dismissed as idle gossip, a smear campaign, a misreading of diplomatic politeness. But then the documents came out, the photos, the telegrams, and the rumor turned out to be one of the most appalling truths in royal history. Let's go back. Edward VIII was king for just under a year, 325 days to be exact, before he abdicated the throne in 1936 to marry American divorcee Wallis Simpson. It was the constitutional crisis of the century. Love over duty, as the official story goes. But love, it turns out, may have just been the side plot. Because while Britain was watching its monarchy implode over romance, something more troubling was quietly unfolding. Edward and Wallis were already close with various German officials. Some even speculated that Wallis had a personal connection with Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister. After the abdication, the couple took up residence in France, then Spain, and finally Portugal, placing them alarmingly close to the heart of Europe as it tumbled into fascism. And it wasn't just proximity. In 1937, Edward and Wallis took a very public tour of Nazi Germany. The trip was not sanctioned by the British government. It was, in fact, diplomatically horrifying. The couple were given a warm welcome by Nazi officials, toured factories flying swastika flags, and even visited a concentration camp, Dachau, though later accounts suggest they were shown a cleaned-up version. The centerpiece of the visit was a formal meeting with Adolf Hitler himself. Edward saluted. Hitler smiled. Cameras clicked. The British government was appalled. But there was little they could do. Edward was no longer king. He was the Duke of Windsor now, a title designed to suggest respect, while quietly sending him into exile. After the trip, Winston Churchill reportedly warned Edward to stop speaking in public about political matters. The Duke ignored him. Then came the leak. In the late 1950s, a cache of German diplomatic cables and memos known as the Marburg Files revealed that Nazi officials considered Edward a potential ally. Worse, some documents suggested he might be useful in a plan to reinstate him as king if Germany succeeded in occupying Britain. Edward, they believed, would be sympathetic to their aims. One memo even claimed that he urged the Germans to continue bombing England to hasten peace negotiations, because it might pressure the British government to bring him back. The files were suppressed for decades. Churchill, the royal family, and the British government all worked behind the scenes to keep them from public view, citing national security. When they were finally released, heavily redacted, they didn't tell us anything we didn't already suspect. But they confirmed what the monarchy had tried so hard to bury, that the former King of England had flirted, politically and personally, with one of history's most evil regimes. To this day, defenders of Edward claim he was naive, that he was merely anti-communist, that he was manipulated by charm and ceremony. But the pattern is undeniable. He admired German efficiency. He disliked parliamentary democracy. He despised political modernity. And when given the choice between aligning with fascist power or fading into aristocratic irrelevance, he didn't flinch. The image of Edward VIII shaking hands with Hitler, grinning beside Nazi officials, isn't just awkward, it's poisonous. It erodes the carefully curated royal narrative. The story that says monarchs are above politics, protectors of democracy, moral figureheads. Edward shattered that myth with a handshake and a smirk. And if the palace had hoped to cover the mess with corgis and afternoon tea, they were in for another surprise. Because sometimes the filth doesn't come from politics or ideology. Sometimes it just comes from the carpet. Let's talk about Queen Elizabeth II, her beloved dogs, and the royal staff armed with mops. 11. Queen Elizabeth II's corgi poop problem. Queen Elizabeth II was the embodiment of duty. For over 70 years, she reigned with an unshakable calm that could make volcanic eruptions seem like polite inconveniences. She weathered political crises, royal divorces, family scandals, and changing times, all with that same serene half-smile and a handbag that somehow always had exactly what the situation required. But there was one thing even she, in all her composed majesty, never fully got under control: the corgis. Not just one, not two, dozens over the course of her reign. A rolling, yapping dynasty of low-slung fur missiles that nipped at ankles, barked at footmen, and, according to persistent rumors from inside the palace, defecated freely across the royal carpets. Yes, the Queen of England, head of state, defender of the faith, supreme governor of the Church of England, lived in a home where staff had to follow her dogs around with cleaning supplies. At first, it was just an odd bit of trivia. People found it charming, in the way British eccentricities often are when filtered through nostalgia and Union Jacks. But over time, the stories started to pile up. Former palace servants, some speaking anonymously, others quite publicly, described an environment where the dogs had near royal status. They were fed gourmet meals prepared by chefs, addressed by name, and allowed to roam freely, with little regard for the condition of the flooring beneath them. The Queen loved her corgis, that is beyond dispute. Her first, Susan, was gifted to her on her 18th birthday. Susan accompanied her on her honeymoon and was the start of a long, interbreeding canine dynasty. By the time Elizabeth ascended to the throne, she was already a full-time corgi devotee, and throughout her life, she reportedly had more than 30 of them, each with their own personalities, preferences, and occasionally, teeth marks on various butlers. In interviews and memoirs, palace insiders admitted that accidents were common. The Queen, it seems, had a high tolerance for mess if it came from her beloved dogs. But the staff? Not so much. One former royal footman described stepping into a corridor only to immediately step in something that should not have been there. The protocol, he claimed, was to remove it quickly and quietly. No questions, no complaints, no acknowledgement. A royal mess required a royal silence. Even more awkward was the Queen's reported habit of pretending not to notice. She adored her dogs to such a degree that she would neither scold nor restrict them. If a corgi had an accident mid-state meeting, it was simply part of palace life. Guests learned quickly not to mention it. In fact, the problem was so persistent that staff created unofficial systems. Some reportedly carried tissues or cleaning cloths during walkabouts. A few were designated as impromptu dog handlers, not to control the dogs, but to control the damage. But this wasn't just about housekeeping. It was symbolic. The dogs represented a rare point of genuine emotional connection in a life otherwise governed by protocol. Elizabeth, famously private and reserved, rarely showed overt affection in public. Yet with her corgis, she was entirely herself. They were allowed to do what no human could: interrupt, misbehave, break royal decorum, and still be adored for it. That kind of love, as inconvenient as it may have been for the upholstery, revealed something deeper: a monarch who found comfort not in people, but in dogs. Loyal, wordless, and utterly indifferent to matters of state. Of course, not all royal indiscretions have the luxury of being blamed on a pet. Some scandals are distinctly human, caught on camera, preserved in print, and impossible to explain away with a wagging tail. So when a certain young prince donned a costume that made the world recoil, it wasn't about palace mess. It was about legacy, judgment, and how fast a photo can destroy a carefully guarded image. Let's talk about Prince Harry and the Nazi costume. 12. Prince Harry's Nazi costume. It was 2005 and the British press had been unusually quiet. For a few weeks, the tabloids had taken a break from their usual royal blood sport. There were bigger headlines: elections, scandals, wars elsewhere. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, came that photo. There was Prince Harry, third in line to the throne, the so-called party prince, wearing a Nazi uniform at a costume party. Swastika armband, desert khaki, a cigarette in his hand and a smirk that aged poorly by the second. The image, splashed across front pages and broadcast around the world, wasn't just embarrassing. It was an atomic-level lapse in judgment. For many, the photo was shocking. For others, it confirmed something darker: that the youngest son of Princess Diana, born into unimaginable privilege, had spent too much time protected by palace walls and not nearly enough time understanding the consequences of his actions. The party in question had an outfits of colonial and native theme, problematic already. But among togas and safari suits, Harry's choice stood out not for creativity, but for its cruelty. Britain, still grappling with its own history of empire, had never made peace with its World War II memory being mocked, or worse, trivialized, by one of its own royals. The public backlash was immediate. Politicians condemned it. Holocaust organizations demanded an apology. Survivors expressed disbelief. The palace issued a statement almost as fast as the presses ran. Prince Harry has apologized for any offense or embarrassment he has caused. But it wasn't enough. The apology sounded clipped, scripted, obligatory. The scandal wasn't going to be buried in the next news cycle. What made the moment particularly jarring wasn't just the photo, it was who Harry was. Just a few years earlier, the public had watched him walk behind his mother's coffin, a 12-year-old boy forced to embody stoic grief on live television. Diana had been the people's princess, the royal rebel with empathy, and Harry was her more mischievous, more relatable heir. He had that scruffy charisma, that streak of rebellion people found endearing, until it snapped. This wasn't just a bad outfit. It was a rupture in the myth, and the timing couldn't have been worse. In 2005, the UK was approaching the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Holocaust memorials were underway. Survivors were being honored. Schools were organizing commemorative events. And here was a royal, arguably Britain's most visible young face, dressed as the very thing those ceremonies existed to condemn. To Harry's credit, he didn't double down. In the years that followed, he quietly met with Jewish leaders and Holocaust survivors. He visited concentration camps. He spoke in later interviews of shame and regret. But the damage was already baked into public memory. The photo would follow him forever, an unerasable entry in the royal record, and while time has offered Harry a partial redemption arc through military service, philanthropy, and his later break from royal life, the image still lingers as a symbol of unchecked privilege, of how easily a royal, shielded from consequence, could make a gesture that betrayed not just a lack of taste, but a stunning absence of awareness. It also revealed something far more sobering, that within the gilded walls of Britain's most scrutinized family, accountability was still optional. That even in the 21st century, royal behavior could oscillate between absurd and offensive without entirely derailing a public career. But Harry wasn't the first Windsor to suffer under a microscope of image and inner turmoil. Before his uniform came a different uniform entirely, the one worn invisibly by Princess Diana, in silence, behind closed doors, when the pressures of royal life pushed her not into scandal, but into survival. And the rumor that she struggled with an eating disorder? That one was true too. Diana herself told us so. 13. Princess Diana's eating disorder. The British royal family has always demanded perfection. It's woven into the fabric of the monarchy. Duty over desire, appearance over emotion, and silence over truth. So when Lady Diana Spencer entered the scene in the early 1980s, young, photogenic, and seemingly pliable, the institution rejoiced. She was perfect, or at least she looked it. But behind the tiaras and the fairy tale wedding, something else was happening. Something whispered about by palace staff, quietly speculated on by the press, and eventually bravely confirmed by the princess herself. Princess Diana had an eating disorder. Rumors of Diana's extreme weight fluctuations began almost as soon as her engagement was announced. One day she appeared radiant and healthy. Weeks later, noticeably thinner. Observers chalked it up to wedding stress, a restrictive diet, or simply the pressure of royal life. But the palace offered no explanations, and Diana, true to the royal mold at first, said nothing. For a time, the subject existed only in innuendo. Then came the tapes, the interviews, the confessions that stopped the world. In her 1995 interview with the BBC's Panorama, Diana didn't just confirm the rumors, she tore down the wall. "You inflict it upon yourself because your self-esteem is at a low ebb," she said, describing her battle with bulimia. She didn't flinch, didn't euphemize. She spoke plainly. "It was a symptom of what was going on in my marriage," she added. "I was crying out for help." It was a moment of staggering vulnerability, made more powerful by its setting. Here was a woman who had once been told to walk 2 paces behind her husband, now speaking directly into the camera, describing a struggle that millions faced, but few discussed, particularly not royalty. And what made it all the more haunting was how the disorder was treated within the palace. According to Diana, no one wanted to talk about it. "They all blamed the failure of the marriage on the bulimia," she recalled. "And that's taken some time to get them to rethink." Rather than view it as a response to a toxic environment, the royal machinery treated it as a flaw, an inconvenience to be managed, not healed. Meanwhile, the public devoured images of her. The world obsessed over her fashion, her smile, her charitable work, all while she was privately locked in a cycle of shame and secrecy. She was literally starving in plain sight, and still, the illusion held. Diana's honesty changed that. In the years following her revelations, discussions around mental health and eating disorders took on new urgency. Her bravery cracked open the stiff upper lip of British public life. For once, the fairy tale ended not with silence, but with truth. Yet even as she peeled back the layers of her pain, the institution around her remained largely unmoved. Diana was beloved by the public, but isolated by the crown. Her transparency didn't fit the palace playbook. Royals weren't supposed to feel, let alone admit to feeling. But Diana refused to play along. Her eating disorder, once treated as scandalous, became something else entirely. A call for empathy. A mirror held up to an institution that prized optics over honesty. And for a brief moment, the monarchy was forced to look. Of course, Diana's disorder didn't emerge in a vacuum. It grew in the cold air between palace walls, in the spaces left empty by a loveless marriage. For years, the public hoped the fairy tale romance with Prince Charles was real. But the rumors that their marriage was anything but happy? Those were true too. All of them. Because behind every carefully staged royal photo op was a war, quiet, bitter, and deeply personal. Let's talk about Charles and Diana's marriage, and how every loving glance hit a blade. 14. Charles and Diana's miserable marriage. From the outside, it looked like a dream. The Prince of Wales and the shy young Lady Diana Spencer, the heir to the throne and the kindergarten teacher, walking hand in hand under Union Jack bunting, smiling for the flashbulbs. Their 1981 wedding was watched by 750 million people worldwide. She wore a 25-foot train, he wore a naval uniform, and the world collectively sighed, convinced they were witnessing a royal love story for the ages. But as with most fairy tales, the beauty was mostly skin deep. Because from nearly the beginning, Charles and Diana's marriage was not a romance. It was a tragedy in slow motion, and the signs were there for anyone willing to look past the spectacle. The rumors came first, whispers that Diana cried before the wedding, that Charles seemed distant, that he spent a suspicious amount of time talking about one woman in particular, Camilla Parker Bowles. Royal watchers picked up on the clues. A meaningful glance, an offhand remark, a certain bracelet that Charles reportedly gave Camilla, inscribed with their private nicknames, just days before his wedding to Diana. Diana found it. She never forgot. Publicly, they played the roles. They waved from carriages, they visited hospitals and smiled for cameras. But behind closed doors, their relationship was unraveling. Diana was young, isolated, and immediately thrown into a cold, rigid institution with no instruction manual. Charles, already in his 30s, had been in love with Camilla for years and struggled to hide it, sometimes not even trying. Their personalities clashed. Diana was emotional, spontaneous, media-savvy. Charles was cerebral, introverted, and felt increasingly upstaged by his wife's natural popularity. Crowds cheered louder for Diana. Headlines focused on her outfits, her charm, her warmth. And with each public engagement, Charles seemed to shrink next to her glow. The tension turned toxic. They lived under the same roof but spoke less and less. Diana described feeling like a lamb to the slaughter on the day of her wedding. She later said their relationship included 3 people, and the third was Camilla. Charles, for his part, reportedly grew bitter and resentful. He returned to Camilla, emotionally if not entirely physically, and the distance between him and Diana became impossible to disguise. By the early 1990s, the rumors had evolved into headlines. Tapes were leaked. Diana's Squidgygate conversations, Charles's infamous Tampongate phone call with Camilla. The illusion shattered. In 1992, Prime Minister John Major formally announced their separation. It wasn't phrased like a scandal. It was delivered like an obituary. The monarchy had lost its central love story, and the public had lost its favorite myth. But Diana didn't go quietly. In her now legendary 1995 BBC Panorama interview, she spoke plainly about infidelity, loneliness, and betrayal. She described the monarchy as emotionally suffocating and herself as misunderstood, unsupported, and utterly alone. Charles, she suggested, was unfit to be king, not out of malice, but out of emotional unavailability. It was the kind of public airing the royal family had spent centuries avoiding, and it worked. Public opinion swung sharply in Diana's favor. Charles, and by extension the institution around him, looked aloof, calculated, and cold. The House of Windsor had protected many things, scandals, secrets, traditions, but it could no longer protect its image from its own members. The marriage officially ended in 1996, but the damage had long been done. What began as the greatest love story of the modern monarchy ended in televised heartbreak, scandal, and disillusionment. Diana was gone the next year, leaving behind a legacy of compassion, and a royal family struggling to reshape its identity without her. And yet, if Charles and Diana's marriage proved anything, it's that the facade of royal perfection is just that, a facade, one that cracks easily under pressure. But sometimes the cracks don't come from inside the marriage. Sometimes they come from off-the-cuff comments, jokes made in poor taste, and decades of unfiltered privilege. Let's talk about Prince Philip and the racist quips that were never just rumors. 15. George III, talking to trees. George III is one of those monarchs whose reputation has been permanently etched in shorthand, the Mad King. School children learn it like a punchline. Americans remember him as the villain in their revolution. British history books note his illness with a neat asterisk. But what tends to be left out of the polite summaries is just how strange his behavior looked from the ground up, and how his court whispered about it before history ever stamped him with that title. The most enduring story, and one of the most telling, is the rumor that George III spoke to trees. Not figuratively. Not in some charming Wordsworthian, I commune with nature sense. Literally. Courtiers reported seeing the King of Great Britain and Ireland wandering the gardens of Windsor, holding full-on conversations with the oaks and elms. He addressed them as foreign monarchs. He bowed. He gestured. Sometimes he even tried to present them with letters, as if delivering state papers to bark and branches. At first, these incidents were dismissed as stress or eccentricity. George had always been an intense man, prone to overwork and anxiety. But by the late 1780s, his episodes became impossible to ignore. His speech would run on for hours, racing through subjects without pause, often in a loud, theatrical tone. He suffered stomach cramps, sleeplessness, and sudden fits of tears or laughter. Physicians were called. Treatments were tried. None of it worked. The public only learned fragments. Whispers escaped through servants, guards, and visiting dignitaries who saw glimpses of the king in these states. Newspapers hinted but didn't dare spell it out. Parliament debated, discreetly, what to do about a monarch who seemed to be losing his grip on reality. The idea of a regency was floated more than once. The tree story, though, stuck because it was vivid. It captured everything about his decline in one surreal image. A ruler stripped of the ability to distinguish between nature and nation, wandering among the roots of his own mind. And the cruel twist is that, in a sense, the story is true. We have his physician's notes. We have diaries of courtiers describing these scenes. Even his son, the future George IV, wrote about his father's bizarre garden diplomacy. Modern science has offered possible diagnoses: porphyria, bipolar disorder, arsenic poisoning, but none fully explain every symptom. What's clear is that his condition wasn't just medical. It was political. The king's illness destabilized his government, triggered constitutional crises, and left a lasting scar on Britain's image of monarchy. And yet, even as he unraveled, George III's reputation was not entirely one of ridicule. Some contemporaries pitied him deeply. Others admired his endurance. He still tried to perform his duties, even in delirium, scribbling notes and sending instructions to ministers who quietly ignored them. The man who had once been mocked for losing the American colonies became a tragic symbol. A king conquered not by rebels, but by his own body and mind. If there's a thread through all these royal rumors, it's how vulnerability hides under velvet. Monarchs who look untouchable on coins and in paintings reveal themselves in whispers. A toothache, a corset, a laudanum bottle, a conversation with an oak. And sometimes the whispers aren't about illness at all. Sometimes they're about ideology. Because another British king, decades later, would trade his crown not for madness, but for an affection far more controversial: admiration for a dictator on the rise. Enter Edward VIII and the rumors of his Nazi sympathies. 16. Prince Philip's racist jokes. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was many things. A naval officer, consort to the longest-reigning monarch in British history, and a man seemingly incapable of self-censorship. For decades, he played the role of royal sidekick with a stiff upper lip and a sharp tongue, one that more often than not got him into trouble. His offhand remarks were legendary, his timing rarely ideal, and his sense of humor. Well, let's just say it didn't always translate well across cultures. For years, his reputation as a gaffe-prone royal was brushed off with a sort of affectionate exasperation. That's just Philip, people would say, as if the role of the royal jester was baked into the Constitution. But behind the chuckles and headlines was a more uncomfortable pattern. Many of his so-called jokes were racially insensitive, tone-deaf, or downright offensive. The rumors began early in his public life. Whispers of inappropriate comments made during state visits, strange questions posed to foreign dignitaries, and jokes that landed more like insults. For a long time, these stories circulated informally, passed around as anecdotes, dismissed as old-school eccentricity. But then the quotes started appearing in print. And they weren't rumors anymore. In 1986, during a visit to China, Prince Philip told a group of British students that if they stayed too long, they'd go home with slitty eyes. The comment sparked international outrage. Apologies were issued. Diplomatic damage was controlled. But the Duke? He reportedly shrugged it off, and that wasn't an isolated incident. In 1998, he asked a driving instructor in Scotland, "How do you keep the natives off the booze long enough to pass the test?" In 2002, while meeting Indigenous Australians, he asked if they still use spears. In 2003, he told a Nigerian dignitary dressed in traditional robes, "You look like you're ready for bed." These are not urban legends or misquotes. They're documented, confirmed, and publicly reported. The palace's standard response was to frame these remarks as harmless, born of a generational gap or a quirky sense of humor. Philip himself claimed he was simply trying to break the ice, that he didn't mean offense. But intent matters less than impact. And the impact of his words was often humiliation, offense, or diplomatic discomfort. What makes Philip's case particularly strange is how persistently these comments were normalized. They became part of his brand, a running gag, repeated in tabloids and satirical sketches. But for those on the receiving end, they were more than awkward slip-ups. They were reminders of a deeply entrenched privilege, the kind that sees cultural insensitivity not as a failure, but as a personality trait. To his defenders, Philip was a product of his time. Born in 1921, raised in a world shaped by empire and aristocracy, his worldview was undeniably old-fashioned. But many people, born in the early 20th century, managed to adapt. Philip, by contrast, seemed to lean into the caricature of the out-of-touch royal, one off-script remark at a time. And yet, his comments rarely carried consequences. There were no serious public apologies, no disciplinary action from the institution he represented. His role continued, unimpeded, decade after decade. Because in the royal family, discretion has always been more important than accountability. It's worth noting that Prince Philip also had moments of sincerity, service, and devotion, particularly to causes like environmentalism and education. But those moments were forever entangled with the barbs and one-liners that followed him around the world. His legacy is complicated, because it was always allowed to be. For every cringeworthy remark, there was a royal shrug. But while Philip's words were jarring, they at least came out loud. Some royal indiscretions, however, were kept behind closed doors, hidden in mistresses, illegitimate children, and secret affairs whispered about for generations. Which brings us to Charles II, the so-called merry monarch, whose idea of public service mostly involved avoiding his queen and populating England with his unofficial offspring. 17. Charles II's endless mistresses. If you were to design a king entirely from gossip, scandal, and velvet bedsheets, you'd likely end up with Charles II. Nicknamed the Merry Monarch, he reigned not by divine authority, nor great moral example, but seemingly by stamina alone. He outlasted a civil war, a plague, the Great Fire of London, and yet somehow still found the energy to maintain a sprawling network of mistresses, lovers, and illegitimate children that made his court feel more like a well-funded soap opera than a seat of government. The rumors about Charles II were not so much whispered as shouted through the streets of London. They didn't have to be confirmed because they were already lived in the open. His love life was public entertainment. He didn't hide his mistresses. He elevated them, housed them, and gave them titles. If most kings concealed their indiscretions in the shadows, Charles turned his into national theater. By the time of his death in 1685, Charles had fathered at least a dozen illegitimate children by multiple women, none with his queen, Catherine of Braganza. Historians often note this with a kind of bemused detachment, as if he were merely overachieving in the leisure department. But the reality is that his private affairs were public policy. His mistresses wielded influence, received pensions, and were frequently involved, directly or otherwise, in the power plays of the Restoration Court. Perhaps the most infamous of them all was Nell Gwynn, a former orange seller turned actress who became one of the king's most beloved companions. She was funny, charming, and unusually self-aware. Once mistaken for a Catholic mistress by an angry mob, she leaned out of her carriage and reportedly shouted, "Good people, I am the Protestant whore!" They cheered. That was Charles's court in a nutshell, debauched, theatrical, and entirely too comfortable with its own contradictions. There were others. Barbara Villiers, the Duchess of Cleveland, known for her extravagance and temper. Louise de Querouaille, the French Catholic who was suspected of spying. Hortense Mancini, who famously fled her husband, cross-dressed, and became a royal favorite. Each of them left a mark, not just on the king but on the court itself. And Charles didn't just keep company, he kept receipts. His children were not hidden away or denied. He acknowledged them, gave them noble titles, and married them into influential families. The Dukes of Grafton, Richmond, St. Albans, and others all trace their lineage to his royal indiscretions. In fact, a significant portion of today's British aristocracy can claim descent from Charles's extracurriculars. Yet the most telling detail might be how little outrage this inspired at the time. Parliament grumbled occasionally about the cost, but the public largely accepted it. After the Puritan austerity of Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth, Charles's reign felt like a national exhale. The Restoration was, in many ways, a return to indulgence, and no one embodied that better than the king himself. He seemed to believe that as long as he maintained peace, the rest didn't matter. Let the queen live in quiet humiliation. Let the court become a stage for flirtation and farce. Let the king's bedchamber double as a genealogical chart. The crown would endure, and it did. Charles II's reign didn't collapse under the weight of his mistresses. Instead, it floated on them, built on a foundation of charm, scandal, and an almost pathological avoidance of conflict. But where Charles openly paraded his lovers and acknowledged his illegitimate children, another royal took a different approach. He kept his own romantic scandal tucked away from public view. Not in shame, exactly, but in quiet defiance of royal expectations. That brings us to William IV, and the 10 children he fathered with an actress long before he ever wore the crown. 18. William IV's illegitimate brood. Before he was king, William IV lived a life that could best be described as one long, extended rehearsal for irresponsibility. He wasn't supposed to wear the crown, not seriously anyway. As the third son of George III, his destiny looked more nautical than noble. He joined the Royal Navy at 13, eventually earning the nickname the Sailor King. Though historians often note that his most consistent contributions to maritime history involved frequent drinking and dramatic overreactions to criticism. But it wasn't his naval career that cemented his infamy. It was his unconventional domestic life, unofficial, unapologetic, and thoroughly unroyal. For over 20 years, William lived openly with the Irish actress Dorothea Jordan. She was accomplished, popular with audiences, and known for playing breeches roles, female characters who disguised themselves as men on stage, often to flirt their way through social complications. Offstage, she played no such games. She and William had 10 children together. 10. They lived as a de facto family in Bushy House, a country estate that was more comfortable than regal. William referred to her as Mrs. Jordan, even though they were never legally married, and their children took the surname Fitzclarence, a clear signal of illegitimacy, but also an acknowledgement of paternal responsibility. In an era when most royal indiscretions were buried under silence and plausible deniability, William's behavior was jarringly casual. He made no real effort to hide the relationship. He seemed to think being a prince meant never having to apologize. And for a time, that worked. The British press, still developing its appetite for royal scandal, covered him with a mixture of curiosity and bemusement. Dorothea was, by most accounts, well-liked. The public appreciated her talent. The court, less so. She was not a queen. She was not even a noble. She was, in the eyes of the establishment, an actress with far too many children and far too much access. But things changed when William's elder brothers died without legitimate heirs. Suddenly, the man known for naval blunders and theatrical entanglements was next in line, and the fantasy came to an abrupt end. Dorothea was quietly pushed aside. The relationship ended. She was given a pension on the condition she remain silent and stay out of sight. She didn't. Financial trouble forced her to return to the stage, violating the terms of their agreement. The pension was cut. She died in poverty and relative obscurity, while William continued his slow shuffle toward the throne. When he finally became king in 1830, he didn't pretend his past hadn't happened. But he didn't exactly spotlight it either. His Fitzclarence children were not invited into the royal inner circle. They were acknowledged, yes. Some received titles and good marriages, but they remained a separate branch, legitimized just enough to serve a purpose, but never quite welcomed as true royals. And yet, the hypocrisy was rich. William had lived with one woman for over 2 decades and fathered 10 children with her, but upon becoming king, he married a proper German princess, Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, and was praised for his stability. Their union was childless. The public, as always, accepted the edit. What William's life revealed, much like his predecessors and successors, is that royal morality is often a matter of timing and title. Illegitimate children weren't necessarily scandalous, as long as they stayed out of the photographs. Mistresses weren't dangerous, provided they understood when to disappear. William didn't reinvent royal scandal. He simply refused to hide it. And in doing so, he joined a long tradition of monarchs who exercised all the freedoms of private life, until the crown came calling. Of course, not all royal rumors are about scandalous love affairs. Some are stranger, more intimate, the kind that sound too bizarre to be real, until you hear them from more than one source. Take Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's beloved husband, refined, intellectual, and possibly the proud wearer of a rather infamous piercing. 19. Prince Albert's piercing queen. Victoria and Prince Albert were supposed to be the royal couple who finally did everything right. She was the sovereign, he was the supportive consort, and together they projected an image of marital harmony so convincing it reshaped the entire moral branding of the British monarchy. They were young, earnest, shockingly affectionate by royal standards, and if you believe certain persistent historical rumors, hiding a detail that would make even modern courtiers blush. That detail? Prince Albert may have had a genital piercing. Specifically, one allegedly designed not for ornamentation, but for practical fashion reasons. It sounds too absurd to be true, like a Victorian tabloid myth or a satirical cartoon from Punch. Yet the rumor has never gone away. In fact, it's grown in credibility with time, not because anyone found a diary entry labeled, "Today I was pierced," but because enough circumstantial evidence exists to keep the theory alive in the archives of royal eccentricity. Let's rewind. Prince Albert was obsessed with presentation. A man of impeccable grooming and moral seriousness, he had strong views on architecture, social reform, education, and trousers. Victorian men's fashion was, by modern standards, unrelentingly tight. Trousers were tailored slim and worn high. For the upper classes, this became a matter of personal silhouette, especially at court, where every crease and contour was noted. According to the rumor, Albert's piercing was meant to assist with how he draped himself in such trousers. Supposedly, it allowed him to reposition himself neatly and consistently, avoiding any unsightly bulges. The piercing would be secured by a ribbon or looped cord attached to the inside of his trousers, allowing for discreet control and ensuring his appearance remained properly symmetrical in public. This notion is largely attributed to claims made in later Victorian circles, whispered in letters and diaries by those who fancied themselves in the know. Some modern historians speculate that the rumor may have originated not in malice or mockery, but in admiration for Albert's precision and fastidiousness. Still, no physical evidence exists. Not surprisingly, even in death, Albert was spared the indignity of forensic confirmation. Yet the story persisted, possibly fueled by the stark contrast between Albert's perceived prudishness and the private detail such a piercing implies. He was a man of rules and propriety, known to frown on drinking, gambling, and overt displays of wealth. That such a figure might have adopted an intimate modification, however practical, sits at the perfect intersection of disbelief and plausibility. Today, the so-called Prince Albert piercing bears his name, though there's no ironclad proof he inspired it. It's one of those historical curiosities that seems too specific to be invented entirely, yet too awkward to ever be confirmed. And so it sits, preserved in the same realm as the best royal rumors, half fact, half joke, all intrigue. What this peculiar possibility tells us isn't just about Albert. It's about the enduring British need to find something human, even faintly absurd, behind the pomp. Because if Prince Albert, the royal embodiment of decorum and industrial age virtue, had a private arrangement to manage the line of his trousers, then maybe the whole institution is more flexible than it looks. And speaking of flexibility, our next subject had relationships that were far less discreet and raised even more eyebrows, both then and now. He was a warrior king, a crusader, a national hero. But according to chroniclers of the time, he may have also shared more than just battle strategies with his fellow knights. Let's look at Richard the Lionheart and the centuries-old rumors about his male lovers. 20. Richard I, Lionheart, and male lovers. Richard the Lionheart is often remembered as the Platonic ideal of medieval masculinity. Tall, strong, battle-hardened, and draped in a chainmail mythology. He led the Third Crusade, carved his name into enemy territory, and inspired legends from Jerusalem to England. He barely spoke English, spent most of his reign abroad, and treated kingship like a part-time job, but he died a national hero all the same. The moniker Lionheart wasn't a PR stunt. It stuck because it fit. He was fearless, ruthless, and, according to persistent historical rumors, deeply intimate with certain men in ways that made the medieval clergy squirm. For centuries, whispers followed Richard. Chroniclers, priests, and diplomats didn't always say it outright, rarely could they, but they said just enough. Enough to make future generations lean in and wonder, did the King of England, warrior of Christendom, hero of the Crusades, have romantic relationships with men? Let's start with the facts. Richard had no legitimate children. He was married, once, to Berengaria of Navarre, in what appears to be one of the most spectacularly hollow royal marriages in history. She accompanied him for a brief time during the Crusades, was crowned queen, and then quietly vanished from most records. They never had children, and tellingly, they didn't spend much time together. Richard spent far more time with his male companions, particularly one in particular, Philip II of France. Contemporary accounts from the 12th century, especially those written by clerics, describe Richard and Philip's relationship in oddly intimate terms. According to Roger of Hoveden, a prominent chronicler of the time, the two kings were so close that they ate every day at the same table and from the same dish, and at night their beds did not separate them. That line has been debated endlessly. Was it metaphor? Was it political flattery? Or was it a thinly veiled confession of a royal companionship that defied the heteronormative norms of the medieval church. Richard also made several public acts of penitence for sins against nature. Now, that phrase could cover a wide variety of things in medieval theological language, but it often referred to same-sex relations. The church, ever vigilant in its moral policing, seemed uneasy about Richard's conduct. Priests advised him to repent. He did, publicly, more than once. Still, no one ever formally accused Richard of anything, at least not in the legal sense. He was too powerful, too celebrated. His victories on the battlefield eclipsed his ambiguities off it. And perhaps more importantly, the medieval world, while deeply moralistic, wasn't always straightforward in how it dealt with sexuality. Men sharing beds wasn't inherently scandalous. Political alliances were often solidified through personal closeness. But the tone of the chroniclers, the repetition of the phrasing, and the notable absence of women in Richard's inner life leave a long shadow of suggestion. Modern historians remain divided. Some argue that the evidence is circumstantial, the phrasing too vague, the standards of medieval friendship too alien to interpret through a modern lens. Others see a clear pattern. A man who lived most of his adult life in military camps, surrounded by men, avoiding his wife, and publicly repenting for something unnamed but heavily implied. Whether Richard was romantically or physically involved with men may never be definitively proven. But the rumors persisted because they reveal something fascinating, not just about Richard, but about the monarchy itself. Even at its most militaristic and mythologized, royal life has never been as straightforward as it looks in tapestries. And Richard wasn't alone in commanding both fear and speculation. In a more modern time, another royal made headlines for something less ambiguous. Sharp-tongued, unapologetic, and allergic to small talk, she didn't care about speculation. She preferred to end the conversation before you had a chance to begin it. Let's talk about Princess Anne, and the rumor that she might just be the rudest royal alive. 21. Princess Anne's sharp tongue. If the British royal family were a dinner party, and in many ways it is, Princess Anne would be the one who shows up early, leaves late, and doesn't care who she offends in between. She is, by reputation and by countless eyewitness accounts, blunt, direct, brutally uninterested in ceremony for ceremony's sake. And perhaps the only royal alive who could deliver a devastating one-liner while walking away from you at full speed in a tweed blazer. For decades, rumors have swirled about Anne's personality behind palace walls. While her brothers dabbled in scandal and spectacle, and her children drew media attention for their very existence, Anne was carving out her own legacy, one barbed comment at a time. She never courted attention. She never chased headlines. But she got them anyway, usually after someone in the press or public found themselves on the sharp end of one of her famously icy replies. The whispers began long ago. Princess Anne was rude, not occasionally brusque, not privately impatient, rude. There were stories of journalists cut off mid-question, of charity workers stunned into silence by her withering remarks, of staff who avoided casual interaction for fear of being eviscerated by accident. And as more people came forward, often with similar tales, it became harder to dismiss them as exaggeration. One former palace insider described a moment when Anne was presented with a bouquet of flowers by a nervous schoolgirl. Instead of cooing politely, the princess allegedly glanced down and said, "Next time, try not to crush the stems." Another account tells of a royal reporter daring to ask Anne a personal question, only to be met with a stare and a brisk, "Do I look like I want to talk to you?" Even public appearances carried risk. During a walkabout, a member of the public once asked if Anne enjoyed royal life. Her response? "It's a job, not a holiday." She kept walking. To her defenders, Anne's attitude isn't rudeness. It's efficiency. She sees no need for the performative warmth expected of royals. If you've shaken one hand, you've shaken them all. If you've heard one speech, the others will rhyme. In her view, the job is about work, not small talk. And to be fair, her work record supports that. Year after year, she's among the hardest working royals. Hundreds of engagements, often low profile, no fanfare, no fuss. But there's a reason the rumors have teeth. Anne doesn't just avoid charm, she seems to actively resist it. She's cut from a different cloth, less velvet, more sandpaper. Unlike other royals who rely on polished PR and controlled imagery, Anne operates on instinct. If she doesn't like you, she won't pretend. If she's bored, you'll know. If you're holding her up, she'll probably tell you. She once famously told an overzealous photographer to naff off, a phrase that would echo across headlines and cement her status as a no-nonsense royal with no patience for nonsense. And while her language is rarely crude, it's her tone that does the heavy lifting. Even her compliments tend to feel like instructions. Yet strangely, that's part of her charm, an accidental authenticity. In a family known for discretion and platitudes, Anne's frankness feels almost refreshing. You might not enjoy talking to her, but you can be sure you're not being lied to. And perhaps that's why the public has, over time, come to appreciate her. She's the anti-spin royal, the one who shows up on time, says what she thinks, and refuses to smile unless there's a real reason. She's not trying to be loved. She's trying to get on with it. Still, even Anne's icy professionalism doesn't quite rival the humiliation of a queen whose body betrayed her most personal hopes twice on a very public stage. 22. Queen Mary. I's phantom pregnancy's history remembers Queen Mary the Roaring with a nickname that needs no introduction, Bloody Mary. It's a legacy soaked in fire and smoke, earned through the execution of Protestant dissenters, and immortalized by both historians and cocktail menus. But behind the image of a grim-faced queen with a torch in one hand and a rosary in the other lies a quieter, more tragic legacy, one that haunted her reputation long before the burnings began. Mary was desperate for one thing that could secure her power, soothe her insecurities, and silence her critics: a child. Her entire reign depended on it. As England's first official queen regnant, ruling in her own right, not through a husband or regency, Mary's claim to the throne was constantly questioned. Her gender, her faith, her legitimacy, thanks to her father Henry VIII's marital gymnastics, all of it undermined her authority. In the eyes of many, the birth of a male heir would solve everything. So when she married Philip of Spain in 1554, hopes were high, and the pressure was crushing. Philip was younger, powerful, and famously unenthusiastic about staying in England. The alliance was political and unpopular. If Mary could at least give him a son, she could secure both her throne and her marriage. What followed was one of the most humiliating chapters in royal history. In 1555, Mary began showing signs of pregnancy. Her belly swelled. She felt movement. Her physicians agreed. The court rejoiced. Plans were made for the birth. Cradles were ordered. Names were chosen. Parliament passed legislation for Philip to act as regent in the event of Mary's death in childbirth. The entire country braced for a royal heir. And then, nothing. The due date came and went. No labor, no child, no explanation. Days turned to weeks. Whispers turned to snickers. By the time it became clear that Mary had not, in fact, been pregnant, the damage was done. The court fell silent. Parliament avoided the topic. Foreign ambassadors updated their dispatches with careful language. Mary, devastated, vanished from public view for weeks. And just when the gossip started to die down, it happened again. In 1557, Mary once again announced she was pregnant. She retreated from court, preparing for confinement. This time, the reaction was more cautious. Fewer celebrations, more side eyes. But still, preparations resumed. And once again, her body betrayed her. There was no child, no explanation. The pregnancy, like the first, had been a phantom. Modern historians believe Mary may have suffered from pseudocyesis, a rare condition in which a person experiences all the physical symptoms of pregnancy without actually being pregnant. Others speculate that the symptoms were related to tumors or hormonal imbalances. Whatever the medical cause, the political fallout was catastrophic. To Mary's enemies, these phantom pregnancies confirmed everything they wanted to believe, that she was delusional, unstable, unfit to rule. To her supporters, they were a source of deep sadness, a reminder of the pressures she endured and the isolation she suffered. But to Mary herself, they were devastating. Not only did she fail to produce an heir, but the public unraveling of her most intimate hopes humiliated her on a national stage. It also sealed her fate. Without an heir, the throne would pass to her half-sister Elizabeth, a Protestant, a rival, and a living symbol of everything Mary's reign was trying to suppress. In a cruel twist of royal irony, Mary's body had not only denied her legacy, but ensured the triumph of the very movement she tried to destroy. When Mary died in 1558, childless and broken in health, she left behind no dynasty. Only a cautionary tale, one of hope turned humiliation, of faith without fulfillment. The woman who tried to restore Catholic glory to England had instead become a symbol of royal fragility. But not all royal indignities are metaphorical. Some are painfully literal, and, in one monarch's case, awkwardly intimate. Let's talk about Henry VIII again. Not his wives, not his appetite, but the very specific and surprisingly prestigious courtier whose job it was to help the king use the toilet. 23. Henry VIII's groom of the stool role. There is a very specific irony in the fact that one of the most powerful, feared monarchs in English history, a man who beheaded wives, broke from Rome, and reshaped his entire country in the image of his ego, relied on a courtier whose primary job was to help him go to the bathroom. And no, that's not a metaphor. It was an actual title. Groom of the Stool, a position as real and official as Chancellor of the Exchequer or Archbishop of Canterbury. A job that was as intimate as it was influential. Because while the name sounds like something you'd hear in a Monty Python sketch, the Groom of the Stool was, for a time, one of the most powerful figures in Tudor England, especially under Henry VIII. The job description? Simple in theory. The groom was responsible for everything involving the king's privy needs. That included preparing the king's portable toilet, essentially a velvet cushion commode, assisting with undressing, standing by during the act, cleaning up afterward, and ensuring the monarch's comfort throughout. And yet, despite its unglamorous specifics, this role wasn't handed to lowly servants. Quite the opposite. The position was reserved for noblemen of high standing, men from elite families, future lords, advisors, even statesmen. The proximity it offered wasn't just physical, it was political. Because in Tudor England, the one thing more valuable than bloodlines or battle victories was access. The groom of the stool had access. He was alone with the king daily, trusted in the most private of moments, present when no one else was allowed to be, and that meant he heard everything. The complaints, the plans, the offhand comments that shaped court appointments, land deals, marriage negotiations. He was a walking intelligence agency with a linen cloth in one hand and state secrets in the other. Under Henry VIII, the position reached its apex. Henry was famously paranoid, suspicious of plots, and obsessed with loyalty. He wanted someone beside him who could be trusted, completely, unconditionally, and quite literally with his life. That someone was the groom of the stool. Sir William Compton, one of the earliest and most powerful holders of the position under Henry, used his influence to acquire land, titles, and extraordinary favor. Later grooms like Sir Henry Norris and Sir Anthony Denny would become key political players, courtiers whose careers were launched by knowing precisely when to speak and when not to. By managing the king's bowels, they managed the court. And it wasn't all routine. Consider the health crises. Henry, in his later years, became severely overweight and was plagued by an ulcerated leg wound and chronic constipation. Yes, that too. The groom of the stool wasn't just ceremonial during those years. He had to manage real discomfort, real risk, and still carry himself like a lord of the realm. This wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. The closer you got to the king's throne, in every sense, the closer you came to his moods, his paranoia, and his unpredictable wrath. One slip, and you weren't just out of favor. You might be out of a head. Yet for all the risks, the position remained coveted. It symbolized total royal trust. In an age where royal favor determined everything, property, marriages, futures, the groom of the stool could make or break a man's entire legacy. There are records of noble families lobbying to have their sons appointed to the position. Not despite the job description, but because of it. And while modern ears might recoil at the thought, the position lasted surprisingly long. It continued into the reigns of Henry's children, eventually transforming into the less hands-on, but still influential, gentleman of the bedchamber. By the Georgian era, it had become more metaphorical, symbolizing closeness to the monarch rather than actual physical service. But the roots remain the same. What this bizarre, very real role reveals is a core truth about monarchy, that even the most elevated institutions are built on very human foundations. That power and dignity are often maintained by people doing deeply undignified work. That behind the regalia and rhetoric, someone still has to hold the towel. In Henry VIII's case, the throne wasn't just made of gold. It came with plumbing. And while his groom managed matters behind closed doors, another royal, centuries later, made his mess in far more public fashion, fueled not by power, but by pastry. Next, we revisit George IV and the disgusting dinner habit that became his most enduring rumor. The king who ate himself sick, then returned for seconds. 24. George IV's vomiting sessions. If Henry VIII was the original blueprint for royal overindulgence, then George IV was the deluxe, gold-embossed, extra butter on everything edition. As Prince Regent and then King, George managed to embody every excess imaginable: art, architecture, affairs, fashion, but nothing defined his reign quite like his appetite. Not just for food, though that was impressive. George's real hunger was for spectacle, indulgence, and the soothing lie that there could be such a thing as too much for a king. And yet, even in a life defined by grandiosity, the rumor that he routinely ate until he vomited and then kept eating stood out. It sounded cartoonish, Victorian grotesque at its finest, something the press invented to mock him. But the uncomfortable truth? Multiple first-hand accounts confirmed it. The story comes to us from those who knew him best: courtiers, staff, foreign dignitaries who had the misfortune of being invited to dinner. George, they said, would gorge himself at banquets until he could no longer contain the meal, at which point he would discreetly excuse himself, vomit, and return to the table for another round. It was not a one-time episode. It was, by all accounts, routine. His meals were sprawling productions, lavish to the point of parody: courses of roast meats, fish and rich sauces, mountains of jellies, puddings, pies, and enough wine to drown a regatta. He was particularly fond of white soup, a rich concoction made with veal stock, cream, almonds, and Madeira wine. Food historians describe his palate as aristocratic excess meets culinary chaos. He didn't so much dine as he conquered meals. George wasn't shy about his eating habits either. He wore custom-tailored clothing with increasingly elastic waistbands, and by the end of his life his girth was the stuff of legend. His waist reportedly measured over 55 inches. He had to be lifted onto horses with the aid of pulleys, and his staff struggled to find chairs that could safely support him. Portrait artists, ever loyal to royal dignity, painted him slim and commanding. Reality, meanwhile, was less forgiving. According to memoirs written by those in his court, George often complained of stomach discomfort during meals, only to immediately resume eating after relieving himself. No one dared mention the absurdity of it. They smiled, nodded, and tried not to make eye contact with the servants who knew where he'd just been. This wasn't gluttony in the casual sense. It was something more ritualistic, compulsive, performative, possibly even pathological. His relationship with food reflected the broader themes of his life. No limits, no accountability, and no real sense of proportion. Even Parliament got tired of it. As his debts spiraled out of control, he reportedly owed over £600,000 at one point, a sum so absurd it required literal acts of Parliament to bail him out. Critics began to view his eating habits as symbolic of his overall failure to govern responsibly. He was, as one pamphlet put it, a monarch who has mistaken the nation for a pudding and intends to consume both. What made it more disturbing was how normalized it became within royal circles. His inner circle, desperate to stay in favor, enabled him. Banquets continued, tailors stitched bigger buttons, portraits were edited, and no one said what they were all thinking. The King of England was eating himself into incapacity. As George's health declined, the consequences of his lifestyle became impossible to ignore. He suffered from gout, dropsy, edema, and severe digestive issues. His eyesight deteriorated. He became reclusive, irritable, and chronically unwell. Yet even then, the meals didn't stop. If anything, they became his last refuge. The table was the one place where he still held dominion, where no one could interrupt him, where no truths had to be confronted. He died in 1830, bloated, blind in one eye, and so physically deteriorated that his physicians reportedly struggled to find a strong enough coffin. Even in death, his size was a logistical problem. George IV was mourned by few and mocked by many. But he left behind a legacy that's hard to ignore, a cautionary tale of how the throne, when left unchecked, can turn into a mirror that reflects back only what the monarch wants to see. And as grotesque as his indulgences may have been, George's excess was, at least, confined to private dining halls and royal apartments. For another royal centuries later, the scandal would be far more public and deeply personal. It came in the form of secret tapes, a telephone line, and a woman who wasn't his wife. Next, we return to the 20th century for a scandal that was whispered, denied, and then confirmed with the push of a play button. Princess Diana and her recorded suspicions of Prince Charles's affair. 25. Princess Diana's recording of Charles's affair. By the late 1980s, Princess Diana had stopped pretending. The fairy tale had long curdled into something cold and sharp, a marriage hollowed out by indifference, betrayal, and the suffocating weight of royal duty. The public still wanted their picture-perfect palace couple, but behind the palace walls, the myth was already bleeding out. The rumors came first, always the rumors. That Prince Charles was still in love with Camilla Parker Bowles. That Diana knew. That the couple were living separate emotional lives under the same gold-trimmed roof. Tabloids speculated, insiders hinted, the palace deflected, but something about the story wouldn't go away. And then, Diana made a move that would change the monarchy forever. She started recording herself. Not in front of cameras, not for public release, at least not at first. These were private tapes, made in secret, sometimes passed through intermediaries. In them, Diana spoke freely about her pain, her suspicions, and the deep loneliness that came with being a royal icon in an emotionally bankrupt marriage. She recounted Charles's behavior, his coldness, and most damningly, his obsession with another woman, Camilla. These tapes were passed to journalist Andrew Morton, who used them, without initially revealing their origin, to write Diana, her true story, in 1992. The book stunned the world. It portrayed Diana not as the fragile ornament of royal PR, but as a woman betrayed, isolated, and pushed to the edge. Though the palace denied her involvement, Diana had, in effect, detonated a truth bomb beneath the entire Windsor narrative. And yet, even Morton's revelations paled in comparison to what came next. Enter Camillagate, also known, less poetically, as Squidgygate 2.0. It was the tabloid scandal that finally ripped the curtain off what everyone had suspected for years. In late 1992, a tape was leaked to the press, an intimate phone conversation between Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles, recorded in 1989. The audio, grainy and cringingly real, revealed Charles expressing not just affection, but full-blown emotional dependence. He joked that he wanted to be reincarnated as Camilla's tampon. Yes, that quote, and gushed about missing her when they were apart. The headlines wrote themselves. The public was aghast, amused, and oddly vindicated. The heir to the throne, caught in a late-night call that sounded more teenage obsession than regal romance. More importantly, it confirmed everything Diana had been saying, behind closed doors and into the recorder. The fallout was brutal. Charles and Diana's separation was announced almost immediately after the tapes went public. The palace went into damage control. Charles's approval ratings plummeted. Camilla, once a barely recognized name in the press, became a household one, for all the wrong reasons. But behind the public embarrassment was a deeper truth. Diana had known all along. She had seen the affair not just as a betrayal, but as proof that the royal family would protect itself before protecting her. She once described her marriage as a crowded arrangement, famously noting, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." The tapes were her way of reclaiming the narrative. In later interviews, Diana admitted that recording herself felt like the only control she had left. Her voice, unfiltered, anxious, angry, offered a stark contrast to the curated images the palace pushed. Through these recordings, she gave the public a glimpse of what life inside the royal machine actually looked like: alienating, controlling, and emotionally vacant. For the monarchy, the tapes marked a turning point. They could no longer hide behind press releases and family portraits. The British public had heard the future king in his most unguarded state. And they had heard the future king's wife, not as a symbol of grace, but as a woman fighting to be believed. Diana's recordings weren't just emotional catharsis. They were a form of resistance, a carefully calculated act of truth-telling in a world where silence was expected, even enforced. Her decision to speak into that tape recorder, alone, candid, trembling, reshaped public perception of the royal family forever. The woman once called a fairy tale princess had become something else entirely, the narrator of her own downfall. And in doing so, she pulled the curtain back on the monarchy's most sacred illusion, that love, loyalty, and family always come first. They don't. Not always. Not in that house. And with Diana's words echoing through headlines and living rooms, it became painfully clear that some royal truths can't be buried with titles, ceremonies, or commemorative plates. But long before recordings, before phone taps and media leaks, there was a time when royal secrets were hidden in trees, cloaked in madness, or drowned in sweet wine. And there was one monarch, centuries earlier, whose love of sugar didn't just rot his teeth, but shaped how a queen came to be remembered across Europe. Let's end where we began, with the infamous smile of Queen Elizabeth I.